Hello my dear friends, how are you? My name is Ari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about Viking tattoos. Vikings did or did not have tattoos on their bodies, and if they had, which ones? A lot of subscribers of this channel have been asking me this, and so did my patrons. Everyone is eager to get Viking related tattoos. But most choose Icelandic magical staves to tattoo on their bodies. And those are not Viking, I'm afraid. There is a clear difference between Viking religious symbols and Scandinavian religious and magical symbols. If we focus solely on the Vikings, we are restricted to a short period in the history of Scandinavia. Therefore, the religious symbols are also just a few. But about that and magical staves further ahead. First things first, let's start with the Vikings and their tattoos. We have had interesting archaeological findings of human remains and mummies of Europeans with tattoos on their bodies. Since the Paleolithic all the way to the Bronze Age and Iron Age, Celts had tattoos on their bodies, so did the Slavic peoples. And here and there occasionally we find a body with tattoos on the skin. But when it comes to the Nordic peoples, in general, movies, books, games just focus on the Viking Age and portray the Vikings as being brutes covered with tattoos and strange symbols, some of which didn't even exist in the Viking Age. So, historically speaking, most certainly the Vikings had tattoos almost like everyone else, but it's hard to say if it was common or just for specific groups connected to a particular cult, and it's also hard to say what kind of tattoos they had. I'm sure you have all heard about Hamed ibn Fadlan ibn Halabas ibn Rashid ibn Hamad, also known as Antonio Banderas. No, just kidding, of course, but it's the very extensive name for the 10th century Arab Muslim scholar, ambassador, and historian from Baghdad. He is perhaps the best source of information about the physical appearance of the Vikings. He met the Norse people sailing along the Volga River in what would later be called Russia. He met the Viking slave traders who gave Russia its name, the Swedish Rus. Hamed ibn Fadlan describes these Norse people as the Russia, as being very tall and fair and their bodies near to perfection. And he also mentions that all the men were tattooed from the tips of their fingers to their necks. Mostly dark green figures of trees, symbols and certain designs resembling the women's neck rings, maybe possibly referring to knotwork patterns as we see depicted on rune stones. So far, we have little information about Viking tattoos. There was no word for tattoo in Arab, for instance, so the closest we get is decoration, sakrifa. I believe it's the word, not sure though, but it's referring to adornment, beautify something with decorations, like describing a mosque's decorations whose geometric patterns come closer to the Norse knotwork patterns. We also know that the Norse, both men and women, had eye makeup and they dyed their hair. So maybe it's possible that these tattoos were drawn on the skin and could be washed away, using wood ash to make ink, hence the description of being dark green, possibly dark blue tattoos. In the sagas and poems there are no references of tattoos on anyone's body, although there are descriptions of scars. So maybe the Vikings didn't have tattoos because they still had in their culture the prehistoric scarring technique, literally carving designs on their bodies. But It's also possible that these Swedish Rus had tattoos indeed because they were Vikings who constantly traded with Slavic peoples, and Slavs had the tattoo culture, and most of these Vikings settled there and created Russia. Take the story of Vladimir Yasroslavic, the Prince of Novgorod, who maintained close relationships with Swedish Vikings due to his Swedish ancestry on his mother's side, and his first years paving his way to rule Kiev are filled with Swedish Vikings helping him out. So maybe the Rus Vikings had tattoos because they adopted certain aspects of the Slavic culture. It is possible that Vikings, while on trading missions in Russia, learned the tattooing art from the natives. We have to take in mind that this was the Viking Age, medieval times, and most Europeans were Christians, and the rest of the known world was Muslim. So there were only a few peoples out there with tattoos on their bodies, maintaining that tradition, and the closest to the Vikings were the Slavs. If Vikings did have tattoos, not speaking about the Rus Vikings, but those back home in Scandinavia, the Norse, it is likely they would have used Norse designs and symbols in their tattoos found in their artwork, as it can be seen on bone and wood carvings or in jewelry. We must not forget that tattoos in ancient cultures, especially in Indo-European cultures and in their way of thinking, were used as a means of personal identification as well as markings for the people of the same family of the tattooed person to easily identify them after death, in the afterlife. So I'm quite sure the Vikings did have tattoos, but it's just not easy to know which ones, what kind of designs. But we may have hints. We know that during the Viking Age there were still traces of animism and totemism in the Norse culture. I have already done a video about it. And certain warrior groups linked to a specific cult of a warrior deity adopted as their spiritual animal, even their own fylgja, the same animal related to the deity, or they adopted the animal totem of the group. Of course, I'm talking about the Berserkir and Hylfedin, whose animal totems were the bear and the wolf. But there were other animals, aside from the bear and the wolf, that were equally important in the Norse culture: the boar, the raven, and the serpent. I would even dare to say that if Viking women had tattoos, certainly they had snakes on their bodies, because the serpent was a symbol of female fertility, as well as protection and power, and connected to magic and shape-shifting. Only later, with the advent of Christianity, it gained a negative meaning. So, if Vikings had tattoos, certainly not only they had trees, just like Hamed Ibn Fadlan describes, but also animals. Then we have religious and magical symbols that Ibn Fadlan mentions, but does not describe. In terms of Viking religious symbols, I do advise you to watch this video right here, because I think it's important for you to understand the evolutions of Norse religious symbolisms. Solar symbols were very common in the religious and spiritual background of Scandinavia. The sun wheel evolved into the spiral, the filfot, the swastika, the volknut, etc. But solar symbols were much more common during the Bronze Age, and the other symbols throughout the Iron Age, and the swastika was a very widespread symbol in the Germanic world, in all sorts of tools and weapons, pottery, instruments, equipment, etc. And there were still traces of the swastika during the Viking Age, and even on Christian monuments that still retained pagan symbols. So the Vikings probably had swastikas tattooed on their bodies, which unfortunately today it's dangerous to tattoo those symbols for obvious reasons, but the Vikings were not bloody Nazis, so the swastika is a solar symbol. There's no problem with that. And one solar symbol exclusive from the Viking Age with great predominance during the Viking period was the volknut. So that one was probably more tattooed than the swastika, because during the Viking Age the swastika was losing its power as it was progressively being set aside to give way to new symbolisms. The runes, obviously. The runes have always played an important role in the religious and magical practices of Northern Europe. When I did the video about Seder, one of you was astonished that I did not mention the Vidkar, sorcerers and magicians in the Norse pagan society. I have mentioned the Volvur, but not the Vidkar. Well, this is exactly why, because of the runes. The Vidkar or a Vitki is someone who works with the runes and does rune magic. You see, Seder is a state of mind, the psychological ability to take a relative control over minds and places by giving shape to the will. Seder seems to be much more intuitive and synthetic in nature, where a trance state sometimes is required and induced, in which the consciousness would be of relatively less importance. Therefore, much closer to a shamanic practice, while to a Vitki the use of Galdre is much more important in rune magic than in the use of Seder. In Seder, Galdre is also used, but in Galdre, Seder is not used. There is no need, it's not required. In Galdre, predominates the use of incantational formulas, spoken or sung. It's a magical art much more conscious and centered in the physical abilities of the person. And that's what is required most often in rune magic. There is a clear difference between the Volvur and the Vidkar. The Vidkar work with the runes, runology, rune reading, divination with runes, using the runes for healing purposes, etc. Runic work. So it's quite possible that the Vidkar had runes tattooed on their bodies, different runes according to the historical period, and also bandrunar, bind runes, connecting different runes into unique symbols for different purposes. And probably on their bodies, as a reminder, they would have certain incantations written in runes, tattooed in runes. And let's not forget one important account in the Norse myths, Bragi, the god of eloquence and poetry, said to have all the runes carved on his tongue. This might be an indication of Bragi being the patron god of the Vidka, as well as the god of rune magic. This doesn't necessarily mean that people actually carved or tattooed runes on their tongues. I mean, people are crazy, so it's quite possible someone tried. But this might mean that people had runes tattooed on their bodies, or at least scarred on their bodies. The Vidkar were what would later be called black magicians in Iceland, using much more complex runic symbols fused with sacred geometry and incantations, where Galdre was the key to open up the powers of the symbols. I'm talking about magical staves, of course. Magical staves nowadays are by far the most tattooed symbols and signs. People often refer to magical staves as Viking tattoos, or worse, Viking religious symbols. The magical staves are Icelandic symbols and signs created during the 17th century. The Viking age had long been gone. The magical staves went through a process of evolution since the 14th and the 15th centuries, but most of them are from the 17th century. Certainly, there are runes and runic symbols in the magical staves from the pagan past, but most of the magical staves are the mixture of Western and Eastern magical practices, incantations with a mixture between Germanic and the Mediterranean pagan past, as well as from Abrahamic religious realities, and formulas and sacred geometry from the Kabbalah. It's a great mixture. It's the fusion, the consolidation of Renaissance magical practices. So, Algishjalmar, the magical staves with a design similar to the Algishjalmur, such as the Vigvisir and other such variations, the Galdramindir, magical signs, and the Galdrastafir, magical staves, were not symbols known during the Viking Age. Therefore, impossible for the Vikings to have these symbols as tattoos. The only symbol that might have been known during the Viking Age was some early version of the algisialmur, closer to a depiction of the swastika, but it's impossible to know the true form of this symbol during the Viking Age. My dear friends, I hope you are not disheartened by this video. Whatever Scandinavian symbol you have tattooed on your body, it certainly is something with great power and meaning. But don't expect it to be something exclusive from the Viking Age or that the Vikings had it tattooed on their bodies. As I've said, tattoos were much more important back then, markings of the individuality of each person, markings of their spiritual practices, of their warrior groups, their magical works, and also to differentiate each individual after death, to come to the gods with their stories written on their bodies, so the gods would recognize them, as well as their family and community members. I'm not saying that the symbols you have are not important to you and they do not mark your spiritual position and your individuality. Of course, your tattoos are important and part of your story and who you are, but the psychological factor changed. A lot of people tattoo symbols because it looks cool and to socially be accepted by certain groups or as a statement, but in ancient times the psychological value of each tattoo was very much connected to the spiritual sphere, especially for the Norse, whose concept of the soul did not make a clear difference between the body and the spiritual self. So their tattoos not only were to last a lifetime on this world, but also in the afterlife. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video and tack för idag.